There's a lot of people who are looking forward to this because you're a very, very popular figure on our side, way more popular than me. And once people heard that I was getting Endeavour on, they were jacked up. And I'm here with Endeavour, who is the primary writer and sole writer of royalendeavour.substack.com. I encourage everyone to go and check that out. You can find him on Twitter at Royal Endeavour, and that's Endeavour with a U, just for the Yanks out there. And a lot of people know him as the co-host of Morgoth and Endeavor's classic movies, where you've got, I don't know how many episodes, like just around 30 episodes.
About yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the more popular shows on our side. So I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to sit down with me today, Endeavour.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Now, for those who don't know your story, I find this stuff very, very interesting. So just to give people a brief introduction, you're a Canadian guy, and I've been trying to get more Canadian talent on here recently, but you're currently in Russia. Would that be correct?
Yes, that is correct. And that's a long story.
Well, if you'd care to go into it, I'd love to hear it. But
Sure.
because I was curious, not only the story, but kind of what guided you to there, and maybe your experiences as a Canadian in Russia. Because we talk about Russia a lot on our side, obviously due to the conflict in Ukraine, but I have yet to hear from someone on the ground in Russia, your perspective on global affairs. So please give us some insight.
Yeah, so basically, I had started my channel about 5 years ago at this point, 5.5 years ago. At the very end of 2017 is when I got into YouTube. And then about a year and a half after I had started, so at that point I was still living in Canada. About a year and a half after I had started YouTube, I wasn't really happy with the way that things were going for me there. I didn't really enjoy the work that I was doing. I didn't enjoy living in Toronto. I mean, it's it's my hometown, but it's one of the most paused cities in the world, and it's become transformed out of recognition.
And just so you know, I lived in Toronto for, I think, between 5 to 7 years, and we talk about Toronto quite a bit on the show as well.
So when did you live there? When did you live there?
Up until a few years ago. We moved out, I'd say around 3 years ago. I was there with my wife, and we lived all over Toronto. So we were on the East End, West End. Right before we moved, we were right down by St. Lawrence Market in a condo building down there. We've got stories for days, because you know the city, right? So if you're downtown, it sounds good to a lot of people living downtown, but there's so many homeless shelters downtown, and there's so many, like, the parks are just overrun. And that was back then. Even worse now, because I went back to visit just even last week, and it has gotten, however you remember it, I'm sure it's gotten, if you can believe it, 10 times worse.
Yeah. So what part of Canada do you, I mean, if you're not to dox you, but what part do you reside in now?
We're still in Ontario. I've lived in Ontario, various places in Ontario, my whole life. Previously in my life, we'd lived in Ottawa. I'd lived in Oshawa, primarily those places. And I was born in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. So kind of around that area. My co-host, Judas, same thing. We met in high school out there in Oshawa. So kind of a steel town sort of upbringing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So back to my story. So yeah, I was living in Toronto until I turned about 24, and then that's when I decided to up and move to St. Petersburg, Russia. I know it's a pretty huge. It was a pretty huge change, but I found I was offered a job here, and then I decided to change spheres and then move all the way out here. And I had been here for about a year by the time COVID kicked off. And at that point, nobody knew what was going to happen yet. Nobody knew what was to come in the craziness of the next 2.5 years. And of course, not that I need to go into this now, but it wasn't really because of the virus itself. It was more just the insanity of the policies which these governments around the world enforced against people. But I basically had it, but I didn't know what was going to happen. Beginning of 2020, I had been in Russia for almost a year at that point, and I had a choice. Well, okay, do I stay here or do I go back to Canada? And then I decided to stay, and it turned out to be a good decision because It was much. It was much better to be here than it was to be there at that time. Canada it was pretty horrible place to be during COVID. And that's as an outsider. I wasn't there the entire time. And then about 2 years later, the war with Ukraine started, beginning of 2022, and I mean, if you'd like, I can get into that as well. Like, I'm not somebody that's like that partisan on the issue. I just consider it kind of it's not my conflict. It's not something that I feel like is something that I'm heavily invested in.
Well,
But
that's something my co-host, he lived for around a decade. He's a Canadian guy, but he lived in Hong Kong.
uh-huh,
And he said very much it's a very similar thing where when there were political uprisings, he was there during those big Hong Kong protests.
yeah.
And he said he felt it wasn't his fight. So he kind of felt like even if he did have an opinion, he felt like he shouldn't. So it's interesting hearing that commonality there.
Yeah. So again, I was kind of struck with the decision, and to be honest, it was easier at this point because again, I didn't know what was going to happen, but I decided to stay. I decided not to leave, which for most of the Westerners who were here at the time, most of them left at the beginning of COVID, and then the few that came back after that, almost all of them left as soon as the conflict started. But I decided to stay. And I finally got a chance to visit Canada this past holiday season. So December, January, this past holiday, this past year, and beginning of this year was the first time that I actually had the opportunity to go back to Canada in about 3 years, and then I returned here in January of this year. So yeah, I mean that's kind of the backstory of why I'm here and what I've been up to in the last 2 3 years. If you'd like to ask anything about what life is like on the ground, I can answer that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I suppose the first broad question I would ask is, how are you viewed as a Westerner there? I'm building that off of the what you had said, which is a lot of Westerners had left at the start of the conflict, and as someone who has remained behind, are you treated any sort of way?
Not really. I would say that most people still seem to be very positive towards me. I only had, I'd say, maybe one minor thing where I only had one kind of minor situation, and really nothing came of it. So for the most part, everything has been fine. There hasn't really been any issue with me being a Westerner, despite what you'll hear in the media. Like my family in Canada has been freaking out. I mean, they've calmed down a bit, but certainly when this all started, they were pretty freaked out that I was still here. But no, in that regard, it's been fine.
I have one question that you had just briefly mentioned there. Do they see you as a Canadian or as a Westerner? Meaning, do they draw any sort of delineation between types of Western? Because this is something we talk about quite a bit on our show. How a lot of us, what we might call the West, are viewed as Western, whereas Canadians think, oh, we're treated as special. But are you treated as just a Westerner?
Well, I'd say yes and no. I mean, how much how much of a difference is there to a Russian between a Canadian and American? Not all that much. I mean, maybe like America, and it kind of has a history of being more adversarial towards Russia. But I mean, Canada and America have been basically buddy buddy for the last couple centuries. So I'd say there's not like a major difference between like the way you'd be treated if you were Canadian and versus American. Maybe there's a bigger difference between, say, somebody who might be continental European from, say, France or Italy or somewhere like that. But there's similarities. But then I wouldn't say it's like I wouldn't say that it's totally the same.
Well, it's interesting. The only reason I bring that up is because we're doing a little bit of a geopolitics arc on the show, we discussed John Mearsheimer in the past and offensive
Uh huh.
realism, but we're getting into some of I think Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. Basically, it's this idea that Westerners don't really see themselves as quote unquote Westerners, whereas like the Chinese might, or the Middle East, anyone in the Middle East might, but and that's more of like a a power reality. The West wouldn't see itself as an adversarial empire, whereas the rest of the world might. And it's interesting hearing how like someone on the ground in Russia would probably see, this is just one big Western empire that's kind of acting in unison. Does that sound accurate, or is that just kind of a rambling bit of nonsense?
Well, I mean that's certainly the message that's coming out of the Russian government and their ruling class. Would I say that that's necessarily accurate about the way that people on the street perceive you? I would say no. I mean, they do see you as a foreigner, but nobody is really like. I haven't really had any issues with that. Nobody has seen me as like being an enemy in any way, other than one kind of minor thing, which like I mentioned, nothing really came from it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when it comes to just the people on the street, it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. They kind of think it's cool that I'm there. Like a lot of people seem like, oh well, what are you doing here? How did you get here? And they kind of find it more interesting than anything else.
What's the view, in your opinion, on the coverage of the Ukraine conflict? Because sometimes, if I were to ever speak to a Russian, they would say that the Western media's coverage is a bit more bombastic, a bit more sensational. Like, from where you're standing? What do you think of our coverage of the war currently?
It does seem quite ridiculous. And there is a problem though and for this reason, to be honest, I'm really not like the person to talk to about the ins and outs of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because I haven't, despite being here, I haven't actually followed it that closely. The problem you get is that every single source on the issue is either partisan to one side or the other. So the only thing they're going to so the pro-Ukraine sources, that including the Western media, is only going to report things that portray the war as being going in Ukraine's favor, whereas the pro-Russian sources, be it from the Russian government or from media sources that are allied with them, and the only thing that they're going to report on is things that show Russia in a positive light and show that they're winning in the war. But I would say that, from the viewing, because I still get the Western media. I still get, on your phone how you have that like news feed of all the news articles that your phone wants you to read. I still get all of those. And a lot of them do kind of seem ridiculous. You'll see ones that say, well, look at all these like tanks which have been blown up, and don't you know that they're all like fighting using weapons from 100 years ago or something. I mean, that really does seem ridiculous. I don't put that much stock in anything that the Western media says. So on the issue, I follow a couple of these like geopolitics Telegram channels, ones that try to be a bit more neutral, and I guess I'll just like take my stuff from there, because I don't really think that you can really trust much that CNN is saying about the whole thing.
And honestly, anyone that says they have the 100% crystal clear read on the situation is a liar, because this war has been going on for quite some time, and everyone I've known who's ever made a prediction has been proven incorrect. And that includes people on our side. I remember, people want you to forget that. There's a lot of people a year ago calling how this war was going to go. Everyone was wrong. Everyone's got bad data. So my position is, I'm like, I guess we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
That's my position too, because I mean, I will be honest that I didn't see it coming up until January of 2022. If you had asked me, I'd say, "Oh no, I don't think anything's going to happen. I don't think there's going to be any conflict." But well, I mean, I was wrong about that. I couldn't read the situation even being here. So I'm not one to make predictions on it, because well, first of all, I don't view it as something that's of. I don't view it as my conflict in particular, and it is something I try to stay as neutral, and I try to stay out of as much as possible, because it is very dicey here. It's a very hot topic, and it's something that extremely controversial, very divided views on it, and I kind of just try to stay out of it.
Me too. Anytime, people don't really ask it much anymore, but when people were at their peak of asking where you stood on it, I'd always give a very frustrating answer. I'd try to give an answer that like pissed everyone else off because, full disclosure, half of my family is Ukrainian. I'm not like on the Ukrainian side, but I was dealing with like for a year, people like every Ukrainian should fucking die. And I'm like, okay, yep, all right, well, we got that. But then, I'm not like a pro Ukraine guy either, and so I would give a highly nuanced answer that was not as sensational as people were expecting. Because like on our side, on what you can broadly call the dissident right, I would say people are generally more pro-Russian in the sense they are anti-NATO or anti-America. That's more. Not everyone is, but that is more common. So they might default to being pro-Russia, but they might not have a passionate reason as why. They just see Russia pushing back against gay invasion. That's kind of how most people see it. So to a lot of people, it's a war against homosexuality, of which Russia is the main, shield against.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know if I would necessarily see it like that.
Yeah,
But the way,
it's a very very us way of seeing things.
yeah, it's kind of simplistic, and I would say that it's two factions who we don't have influence over, and and don't necessarily have the same political goals that we have. So it's one that I don't think that there's that much in. I don't think that there really is that much. At stake for us beyond the economic fallout, and really just kind of hoping that we don't want to see white people killing each other. So my stance on it is that I really just hope for it to end as fast as possible, and for the best outcome for as many people that could possibly happen.
Yeah, I agree completely. And you had recently published an article, and this is what got my attention and wanted to invite you on. Um, it was an article on your Substack, and the title of it was "Are Canadian or More Canadians Red Pilled Per Capita?" And I was hoping you could talk a bit about that, but I did want to mention, in case we don't cover it, the impetus of this article was you this year attending a live event. It was hosted, and if you want to talk about that event specifically, because we never mentioned it on the show, but it sounded pretty interesting, where you met these Canadians.
Yeah. So do you know who Frody Midyard is?
I do, yes.
Yeah, so he's a content creator as well. He's from Scandinavia. I think he's from originally the Faroe Islands. But he does this great weekly show with Mark Webber, and he's done a lot of interviews. And then he over the years he's organized these conferences, and he had the chance to organize the first one he's done since COVID, and that was in Tallinn, Estonia, which is just like a short bus ride. It's about 7 hours by bus from St. Petersburg. I did have to cross the border, but that was like a short trip for me. And I thought, well, that's perfect. I'd love to go. I'm a huge fan of his show, and I'm also a huge fan of Mark Webber in particular. I think he's one of the most astute commentators, and someone who has been championing our cause for 50 years, and someone I respect, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity to meet him in person. So I made the bus trip from St. Petersburg to Tallinn, Estonia, somewhere I had been several times already. But I absolutely love Estonia, and I absolutely love Tallinn, and it's always a pleasure to visit. So we there, at the conference there were about, I'd say, 60 to 70 people. And the amount of Canadians, I think I counted about 7 or 8. So we're talking about 10-15% of the attendees were Canadian, and you have to remember that's all the way over in Estonia, pretty far from Canada, and we're obviously, there's a lot more Americans out there, and a lot more Brits out there, and Canada's not the biggest. It's a big country, but it's not the population wise. It's not the biggest out there. But we were very well represented at this conference, and not only that, I think I met 5 other people from Toronto who were expats from Toronto who had moved to Europe. and who are attending this conference, just like me. So 5 others, so like 6 people, basically the same kind of story. Unbelievable. And that just got me thinking, like, there's a lot of Canadians here, and some really based people, and everyone had the same story. Really, everyone had the same story. Oh, I'm from Toronto, but the place is just paused as hell, and it's depressing, and I'm fed up with the diversity. I'm fed up with all the political correctness. I'm fed up with the high cost of living, and I decided to head off to, what was it, Finland, or a guy went to Slovakia. One guy there went to Hungary, and me to St. Petersburg. And that seems like that was something that was, well, if this is anything to go off of, maybe it's just a coincidence, but there has to be something there. If there's that many people out of this small group, there's that many people that had pretty much the same story. Pretty interesting. So that got me thinking, because another thing I've noticed over the years is that on a lot of forums, in a lot of comment sections, back when I used Discord, I don't use that platform anymore, but you'd see Canadians turning up. It's seemingly in a disproportionate number. So you online platforms that uh, um, that people with our views congregate. Canadians always seem to be very well represented, usually overrepresented. And I got me thinking, like, is it possible that Canada actually has like a higher number of people who are, red pilled, so to say, in our sphere of politics than other countries, like maybe in comparison to, say, the United States or the United Kingdom? I think that there actually is a good possibility that that is true. Now, I don't really put much stock in what the mainstream media says, but I was able to find a couple of articles that, even from the perspective of the regime, saying that Canadians are overrepresented in spreading far right white supremacist views on the internet, and we all know that means basically people who it means people who basically support white interests.
Yeah. And it's interesting they use the word spreading as well, because I think they're latching onto that. They're taking an active role in not only talking and posting, but also larger content creation, which is a phenomena I've noticed before. A lot of people have noticed this too. So you saying this isn't going to sound crazy to people. We used to have a joke that there's only 2 types of people online. There's Canadians and South Americans. It's the only 2 you're going to get. There's always tons of Canadians, like on 4chan back in the day, which seems strange given the nation's size and population, and it's not globally known really as like an outspoken nation, and so it's running up against these 2 realities, right?
Well, not only that, but you'd also think that based on our politics and based on our culture and kind of what's become Canadian identity, we're seen as being like a lot more paused than the United States, for example. We're seen as being, like Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, has basically become an icon of a country being cucked, of a country being paused. And that certainly is the case in Canada. Like a lot of people say, is that Canadians seem to be hopelessly liberal, and it's kind of become part of our identity that we're going to be more. Part of our identity is that we're more enthusiastic about being replaced than Americans are, and it would seem counterintuitive if we've elected Trudeau how many times in a row? 3-4 times already. While in the United States they elected Trump back in 2016. It sounds counterintuitive to suggest that Canadians there might be more based Canadians per capita. But I think that what might explain that is, first of all, the degree to which the agenda is enforced in Canada. I mean, going back to how many people from Toronto I met at that conference, they all had the same story. It was just like, I just couldn't take it anymore. The pause was just driving me mad, and I had to get out of here. And then also that there doesn't really seem to be the same kind of controlled opposition that you see in other countries. So in the United States, they have their fair share. Every Western country at this point has their fair share of pause, but in the U.S. they have people like Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump or Alex Jones, people like that. That someone who's unhappy with the direction of the country can go to that, but they're really not gonna get to the a truly dissident position. It's whether you want to consider the Carlson or Alex Jones to be cucks, or whether you want to consider them to be deliberately trying to as these kind of pressure release valves, deliberately trying to prevent people from actually coming to the conclusions that they need to. Canada has a whole lot less of that than the U.S. or the United Kingdom does. We do have rebel media, but I mean that just like pales in comparison to something like Fox News and the reach that Tucker Carlson has. And yeah, so like people. I mean, my theory would be that if it is true that there are more Canadians who are in our sphere of politics per capita, it would probably be because they find their way here and not to the kind of pressure release valves.
I think that's a fantastic point, and it's something I was thinking about recently because there's two things that cross my mind. One, it's that historically Canada has had a lot of media literacy, very strong media literacy, because you go back to the likes of Marshall McLuhan and others that, we're not a towering figure in that sense, but more than a lot of European countries. Like there's something about Canada, even going back to like the 70s and 80s, we were always into media. But then that point you were making is there's no towering, colossal figure for people to gather around. And I think that's significant because we actually can't have a pressure release. So rather than having these colossal figure that you can become a fan of, like Alex Jones, because Alex Jones has got like what, 50 million fans, something crazy. And he's on the lower end of popularity, right? We don't have that. So it forces a lot of regular people to kind of rise to a lower level, but it's more decentralized. And I remember growing up, just anecdotally, I was always into media. I'm sure you were as well. Movies, music, everything like that. And if you wanted a career in that, the consensus was you had to go to the US. It was the same thing Americans did. Go to LA or go to New York if you want to be taken seriously, if you want to make it to that level. But if you didn't, you had to really you had to rub two sticks together up here and figure out how to make some kind of independent thing going, which will never be as big. But you had all these sort of a wider array of people trying to rise up to something like a mid-level, but like Canadians are more trained to rub those two sticks together to make something work. So I think you'll get more people who are willing to become content creators than fans of content creators. Now, does that sound like it makes any sense?
Yeah, it does. And the other thing is that they're more likely to come to the correct conclusions because, it's one thing to be unhappy about the direction that Western society is going. It's another to actually understand what's going on and then actually being willing to embrace any realistic solutions to that. And say that in the position in the United States, you have this kind of hyper partisan politics that's like on steroids. It's ever present in people's lives. It's like this constant trench warfare between the right and the left, and you have someone like Donald Trump running for president, and it's a lot easier to see a solution within the system and kind of be given that false hope because there is no solution within the system. Electing Trump again is going to be about as effective as it was electing him the first time.
Right.
But in Canada, I don't think that we have that kind of same that same like. They're not. There isn't this like force that's really selling us this kind of false hope. Nobody thinks that by electing Pierre Poilievre, then our country is going to go back to something resembling sanity. I know that there's Maxime Bernier, and to be honest, I actually have some good things to say about Maxime Bernier. I don't want to tear the guy down entirely. I thought that he actually took a stand on a few issues, and I'll commend him for that. But let's be honest, like no political solution is possible. Like the People's Party is not going to get elected, and even if they were, that's not going to turn the country around. So I think that kind of the situation we're in, people are a lot. The reality is a lot clearer here that we are basically conquered and that we are basically being ruled by decree by unelected powers who despise us. That I mean, that's like there for that. That's a lot easier to see. Whereas in the United States, the illusion of opposition within the system is still there.
Yeah, I think you raised a very good point there, which is that I think Canadians have internalized that there is no political solution. Whereas in America, I think there's not for everyone, obviously, but for some people, for a huge swathe of the population, they still think that if they elect the right person, they'll find the right sledgehammer to break the thing that they don't like. But even people on the right here in Canada, like find anyone who gives a shit about Pierre Poilievre. No one's excited about this guy. Maxime Bernier was probably the last guy who might have made people excited. I'm a lot like you. I was one of the first guys to join the People's Party of Canada. But, there is I think there's more people in our situation who will agree, have fully internalized, there's no magic guy we can elect to fix all this. So what now? So what solution do we create? And we must tap into that creativity, frankly. And I think that's why Canada is pretty exciting. Perhaps the same thing can be said about Australia. I can't speak to them, but I look at Australia as very similar to Canada in a lot of respects, and maybe even Ireland. But I think they're having a lot of the same conversations where they're like, we don't believe that we could even have a leader. So what do? We gotta create this sort of decentralized organism similar to our media apparatus. And I think the good news is some people will look at Canada like it's small potatoes because we don't have these colossal figures, but that also means that you can't be taken for a ride. That means that because not everyone has faith in this one figure. That's what I worry about with Tucker Carlson. I like Tucker Carlson, but I'm like, if he just changed his opinion a bit, that would probably change the opinion of like 50 million people.
Yeah.
Like you could corrupt one guy that changes a lot of people way easier. There's no one guy you can corrupt over here. You'd have to change the minds of like 50,000 people at the same time. So like bad ideas take hard. It's harder for them to propagate here. That's my opinion anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, that was kind of the theory that I had. That basically, if it is in fact true, because I don't really have any hard data on it, there is those like MSM articles, if those are to be believed. But it does. I mean, at least my anecdotal experience has been that Canadians seem to be overrepresented in our sphere, even though on average they're more liberal than Americans. But in our sphere, they seem to be overrepresented, and that was kind of my theory. It's just probably because of the reality that how clear it is that we are basically being ruled by this kind of regime which hates us really.
Yeah, and we on previous interviews and on previous episodes of the show, we discussed Canadian issues, and we spoke to this really interesting individual by the name of the Black Horse, and he was talking about the geographic, geopolitical issues in Canada, how it's more east versus west than a lot of people think. They think it's like liberal versus conservative, but you should probably look at it geographically. And in the past couple episodes, we were discussing the intrusion into Canada. Across two episodes, we talked about the intrusion of Canada by the Chinese Communist Party and also the Hong Kong triads through the West Coast. And how they're both working kind of hand in glove together to not only essentially control the entire fentanyl trade in North America, but I'm sure you've heard this 100 times before, but buy up huge arrays of property all across the nation, which then allows them to influence politics as well. So I think that's sort of a crowbar issue. That's where you can get a lot of liberals talking about ethnic issues in a way that you might not even be able to see in America. Once the liberal news admits that China's buying up Canada, that presents some opportunities to discuss, different sorts of ethnic issues that you might not have been able to before.
Yeah, I mean that it goes without saying. If you ever go to either Toronto or Vancouver, I mean, you feel like you're in East Asia, not in North America.
What was your favorite part of Toronto? Because you were born there and raised there. Like, was there any section of the city that you still feel homesick about?
Um, Well, I mean, I'm not from in the city itself. I'm from one of the. I'm from one of the suburbs. I'm from North York. I would probably say North York that would be it, just because it's the place I grew up.
I still count
And
that. I like when people start trying to count Hamilton as the GTA. That's when I get pissed off.
okay, so yeah, North York, and just because that's kind of where I grew up. So, uh, but I don't know, like I don't find it pleasant spending time in Toronto at all. Like riding the bus, riding the TTC, the Toronto Transit, is truly one of the most depressing experiences you can have as a Canadian.
It's soul sucking. And I don't know how it compares to something like it's about as bad as I assume what India is. When you see those videos of like Indians cramming into something, I'm like, it's pretty much the same in Toronto. And like everyone's like, "Oh, you're crazy to own a car in Toronto." I'm like, "You, it is," but I got a car because I hated the bus that much.
Yeah,
You know,
and you just it really, for me, like, it really hammers home that, well, the situation in the country, that you're well, I mean, you get on the bus and you'll be the only white person on the bus. You'll find everyone, people from everywhere in the world except for Canada.
yeah, like I went recently because I get my hair cut there. I still go up to get my hair cut. I'm very loyal like that. But I just walking down by the Eaton Center, which is just a hub of fucking scum and villainy. But it's just you're just being glared at by Somalis all day, and I'm like, this
Yeah.
is who. No one likes this, and no one wants to say what it is they don't like about it. But like, I'm seeing human shit for the first time in my life. That used to be a thing no Canadian had to do, seeing human shit on the side of the road. And everyone knows, like, homeless people, when it's a one-off, it's like seeing a raccoon or a seagull. In fact, they're like seagulls. You get one seagull and they're fine. You get four or more seagulls, now you're on their turf. Now they're walking up to you, they're taking your bologna sandwich, they're stealing your wife.
Yeah. So you've actually seen them, like, defecating in the street?
Yes, I did. Last time I
Oh
was
my
there,
god.
because I went there during the day, like after COVID, like tent cities really took over. Before I left Toronto, we had already relinquished all of the parks, and it's just needle exchange programs everywhere. But now, like once things become a homeless camp, all bets are off. It's madness. It's screaming. It's guys walking like fuck. I tell stories to people. They think I'm making it up. They think I'm making up that there's a naked guy walking down the street in the middle of the day just screaming. And they think, oh no, he's watched too many falling down type of movies. Like, no, you have that's a real thing. I go to the gas station with my wife. I need to get into a physical altercation with the Somali guy who's accosting my wife. And these are
Uh,
real things. And then I know what we don't really have this in Canada, but it's a personality type that you would see in New York. The type, and they're usually white people and Jewish people who like they're so used to living in these hubs of madness that they get an affection for it, especially if they've lived there their whole lives. Like the archetype of like the 55-year-old Jewish woman. There's a store that I always go to in Toronto, right by the Eaton Center. It's called BMV. So like this leftist leaning bookstore, but sometimes they get good books. But it's run by one of those like aging Jewish women who wants black people to like her so much. So and she's like looking around. It's like, oh, a lot of police out today. I'm like, why do you say police? You're a 65-year-old Jewish woman. I keep upping her age every time I bring it up, but I'm like, it's that personality where they like the dirt. They think it's more authentic. They like hearing sirens. And like if you get your bike stolen, they'll act like you're an idiot for caring about it. That I don't know what to do with that type of personality. That makes me angrier than anything else. Like they wear their hardships in these environments as a badge of honor. And I'm seeing more and more people like that, even in Canada, especially white people. Like the fact that it sucks is good, and that the fact that it sucks brings us closer together. And that's sort of this, I don't know, like a soft third worldism that I see bubbling up beneath the surface. I don't know if you've seen that. You probably don't have that in Russia, but you get it a lot here.
well, I don't know. I mean, there are. I did know a lot of libtards that lived there, but I mean, it has been a couple years since I visited recently, but it has been a couple of years since I've lived there full time. And you know, from this, from the way that it looks, and from what I've heard, it does seem to have deteriorated a lot since I was there. So like, I didn't see people defecating on the street and like homeless tents everywhere. I mean, they were homeless, but they hadn't taken over portions of the cities. But it does seem that since COVID, Toronto has gotten a lot worse.
Yeah, and some people don't like when I bring that up because, like, oh, that's the people down on their luck. But I'm sure you'll agree, you have to fall through a lot of floors in Canada before you become homeless. So, and a lot of them aren't. They're like, oh, well, these white people out of work. Not really. There's fewer white homeless people than ever before. It's just you're starting to see like Asian homeless people, which you never used to see before. So I'm like, these are like refugees. These are new people. These are people who just got here yesterday. And I don't know, like it's the same thing in America where you see people fleeing these areas, and I don't know, I flee. There's not a lot of places to flee to in Canada, except of like these small towns, which I guess will become overrun eventually. It's not as bad as the UK yet, where they're just placing them in small towns. But yeah.
Yeah.
So, is there any sense where you are in Russia of this demographic issue? Like, is that brought up in the news and the media at all as a uniquely Western problem, or is that something mainly we talk about? Do you think?
Well, in the news media here, not so much. Uh, but in terms of like the people you talk to, yes, because I mean, while it's not nearly as the numbers aren't nearly as big as it is in Western Europe and North America. I mean, they do have an issue in Russia with migration from Central Asia. Um, and one thing is that people speak a lot more frankly about the issue of immigration. So, like for example, there's a schoolyard where I go. I often go for a run. They have a track with and a soccer field there. And one thing you'll see is that you'll either see Russians playing soccer, or you'll see a bunch of guys from like Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan or wherever they're from playing soccer, and they never play together. So you'll either see all of one or all of the other. Um, and that's something that people are a lot more frank about. So you can just say like, yeah, I mean, you notice that there's like a lot of Tajik guys here. That's something you can just bring it up. It's not taboo. It's not taboo socially to bring it up. I mean, you'll find a few libtards here and there, but most people think, yeah, that it's really kind of not so pleasant to have that many around. But I should also emphasize that St. Petersburg is still, I'd say, 90 to 95% white. So it's not nearly to the extent of Western countries, but people still are conscious of migration and of ethnicity and things like that. And then if you're talking about what's going on in the West, you can just flat out say to people, yeah, I don't really want to go to Paris. It's basically just full of Africans now. There are no French people there. And a lot of people will say, oh, yeah, you're right. You're right about that. In fact, like one woman I had, who was actually a client of mine, basically said that it was kind of funny because it wasn't like she was somebody who was tuned into our sphere of politics or like watched any of our videos or anything like that. But she flat out just said to me that she didn't want to go on a vacation to Paris because she thought there would be too many Africans.
Yeah, well, I've had to say that to my wife too, because
Yeah.
like 99.9% of women on Earth want to go to Paris.
Yeah.
And it's up to every guy to break it to like it's not what you think.
Yeah.
Like we can go, but like wear a vest, wear a bulletproof vest, and a rape-proof pants.
Yeah. Like another thing she said though was because she worked for I forget what company it was, but she worked for an American company, and like I hadn't been like pushing I hadn't been pushing the race issue with her that much, so it's not like it's not like something that I had been like constantly talking about. She just flat out said to me that like when the American executive came, she said, I hope he's white. She even said she hopes that he isn't black.
Because if they
and I said,
If they
Well, I
watch
said,
American movies or TV, they would think like 50% of American executives are
oh
black too.
yes. I even said to her, well, he's an executive, so he probably isn't black. But there was another woman, and she actually another client that we had that, and like this was at work that she said this. She just said this like straight out in her company. And again, she was like I'd say like early 30s, kind of like she was a mom, some kind of like what you think of as a soccer mom or something like that. And one thing she like, we were talking about movies, but I wasn't like pushing the issue. I wasn't like pushing the base stuff too hard. And I said, like, do you guys? I was talking about like the portrayal of Russia in movies, and I said, do you guys think that that Russia's kind of not portrayed very fairly in movies? Do you think it's kind of propaganda? And what she said, I mean, this was only like a week or two after I had moved here, so it floored me when I heard it. But what she said was, I think that they used to make propaganda movies about Russia, but now it's all just propaganda about gays and black people.
Well, it's interesting because I'm always wondering. I'm biased towards the things we say over here because we're in the thick of it. We're surrounded by it all the time. And I'm always curious to see if places elsewhere in the world, A, if they have the same opinion, and B, if they think it's a problem where they are. Because I'd always wondered if, for example, in Russia, if they see like the spread of homosexual acceptance around the world as being pioneered by the West, or if it's just this strange phenomena that's occurring on its own. And I use that because, especially on our side, the LGBT, it's Pride Month, obviously. In Canada, it's Pride season. We actually have 3 months of Pride for people who don't know that. And that's official, by the way. There's this sense that, the LGBT movement is the tip of the spear of Western cultural imperialism. I'm wondering, is that a popular viewpoint where you are, or is sort of like this gay phenomena sort of seen as this just virus that's just springing up on its own?
No, they do view that as being a Western phenomenon, like being pushed by the West. Like the way that the word Europe is pronounced in Russian, it's kind of like Europa. But then what they do is it doesn't really make sense in English, but they have like a slang. They'll say Europa, like saying like gay Europe,
like what it sounds like in English too.
Yeah, so it's like it would be like if you said like it would be like if it was like a and then you probably said gay. So it's like it doesn't really sound that way in English, but in Russian it does sound like it's like gay Europe.
Yeah, and that we have similar thing here. It's the GA, the Global American Empire, which is called the gay. That's the big
gay,
thing on our side.
Uh-huh.
It is interesting because some people will say that, like in China, they'll say there's all these like gay people now that didn't used to be. So there's this idea that maybe it's this generative thing in some sense, or just, hooked into the general birth rate dropping in some of these countries. Like maybe it's that mouse utopia experiment happening on an overpopulated world. I can't say for sure, but where I'm standing in Canada, this does seem like the gayest place on earth by law. I don't know.
Well, it's mandatory by law.
And you had, I know we have to get going soon, but you had another article on your Substack about woke capital. And generally when people say woke capital, it's mostly gay capital. The wokeness really just means LGBT. It's not so much about black as much anymore, but like gay is front and center. It's rainbows, it's trannies. And I was wondering if you wanted to briefly summarize your position on woke capital, since I think that's probably a good way to cap what we were just talking about.
Well, I would have to disagree a bit. That I do think that the race stuff is pretty prominent in it as well. I mean, during the LGBT month, yeah, they it's more of that, but even then, like, and I wrote an article about this as well. But when they have that flag now, the flag that they updated to is the one with that arrow on it with the brown and black stripes. So I do think that the race stuff is pretty prominent in that as well.
That's one of those things that our side would make fun of. It's like, oh, look, being black is being gay, and we laugh about it. But the rest of black people don't see it that way. Gay people don't see it that way. So it's like the things that we would think are plainly on their face like a parody, they just don't see as a parody. I think that's frustrating to a lot of people.
Yeah. But okay, so basically, at least my first article about woke capital, which I turned into a video, it was revisiting my theory about it from 3 years ago, from 2020. So I mean, I made a video back in 2020, which became my most viewed video ever, where I basically theorized. I tried to think like, what is why is it that all these companies are posting this, are so relentlessly pushing woke politics. And I made this during the BLM craze in 2020. The theory, the conclusion I came to in that article, or sorry, that video back in 2020 was that it was about money. It was about creating the consumer society, trying to make a consumer class whose entire identity is about the products that they buy, and that's all they live for. And that it was primarily about money, because I was functioning under the assumption that the goal of corporations is to make money. And the recent article and then video that I made about that is I'm basically revising that theory, because I've since changed my views. I don't think that that money is the primary goal, but behind woke capital. In fact, I don't think it's the goal at all, because it's because it's not profitable. And what I talked about in that article and video is, first of all, how the pandemic showed us that the elites just simply do not care about the economy. They're perfectly happy to devastate the economy, and if it advances other causes that they're interested in. And secondly, I talked about things like ESG and this sustainable development agenda. And then there's the other thing that's tied in with that is the philosophy of shareholder capital versus stakeholder capitalism. The traditional one, shareholder capitalism, is what it means, like that the goal of a corporation is to make money, whereas the philosophy of of stakeholder capitalism, what they say is that, well, it's about creating the best outcome for all the stakeholders, meaning the societal well-being. And what that actually is wokeism. So wokeism is baked into the cake with that. It's pushing political and social engineering. That's kind of the idea of of stakeholder capitalism, that the goal should be social change, and not being in the horrible directions that we all complain about on the internet. So that was basically me. It was me revising the theory that I had come up with in 2020. That I think that really, to understand the phenomenon, it's really not about money. It's more about kind of pushing this social engineering project to, I think, really turn the West into basically third world, basically downgrade the West to be on par with the rest of the world. And I think that if you look at things like the climate change agenda and the policies being proposed, they do go hand in hand. There's a large overlap between the two, and both the climate policies and the woke stuff is also part of Agenda 2030. So that's what the article was about.
Yeah, and the more I think about it, because we've talked about this on the show before, the environmental aspect, especially in ESG, kind of gets shuffled to the background, and people really focus on a lot of the social stuff. But the more I think about it, the more these issues kind of coalesce under the umbrella of environmentalism in the form of population reduction. Some people think, oh, here he goes with his kooky ideas, but hear me out. Being in Canada, on the ground floor of a lot of this, one issue that is very, very popular, especially in the news right now, is MAID, medical assistance in dying. And whether or not people can elect to commit suicide with the assistance of doctors and with the government. The controversy is how much this is being pushed on people who don't have terminal illnesses, but who are living in poverty, or children who are confused. There could be a lot of reasons, and they can pass that off as, oh, this person was contacted improperly. But why not? Why not expand elective suicide to those who are suffering psychologically? So when we talk about woke capital, we talk about one thing we brought up before is white males, especially, tend to be treated as troublemakers. And I think that's why the media is so aligned against them. And you see this with not only things like January 6th, but also the trucker protests. It seems that all anti-COVID stuff, it was majority white guys, frankly. And so if you were a government, a modern government, you would say, who are the troublemakers in society? And if you look at the data, well, it's usually white guys. So we got to do something against them. And really, a lot of people are like, why would they be doing this? Like, they don't need to necessarily target white guys. They filter for troublemakers, that it tends to be white guys. But if you're trying to create a population that is less troublesome, you would probably create, paradigms and create processes that, target those people. And, with MAID, you're trying to, like, what they would prefer is a population, like you had said, with the whole consumer identity. The only identities, if you look, the only identities that are approved by the government are consumer-based identities or genderqueer identities. You're not allowed to really like your gender identity, except genderqueer, except this grab bag of stuff you make up. That's what's being proposed by the government. That is the system-approved identity you're allowed. And what is the system-approved identity is a mentally ill identity, which would imply that what they want is a weak, mentally ill population. Why? Maybe not. Some people are like, where's the document that says that? It's like, well, it's easier. It's less troublesome. It's less violent. It's less, it's easier if people think they're all various shades of queer and arguing about what's on Netflix. That's what it is. And
Well,
so, yeah, sorry, continue.
well, yeah, but I mean, it's also you also have to think about things about how this plays into, say, transhumanism.
Exactly.
So, if that's going to be an agenda that we see in the future, this kind of the idea that identity is something that's just purely malleable, that you can just be whatever you feel, what you are, just whatever you feel like at any given moment, and who is anyone to say otherwise? I mean, that leads pretty. That transitions, no pun intended, or perhaps pun intended, quite well into just into people who are not fully human being viewed as legitimate beings, and like merging humanity with machines. Now we're getting a bit far. I think that is a bit far ahead. I don't think that that's it's not happening at the moment, but you could see that on the cards in the coming future. The other thing I would also add is, yes, I do agree that they do want to get rid of the troublemakers. People of European descent, white people, are the ones who are most likely to oppose this tyranny, especially men as well. That we are a troublesome population. When you look at the third world, it's basically small ruling classes who are extremely rich, ruling over people, big mass of people who are dirt poor and have no capability of actually rising up against them in any way. So that, I mean, there's that element. But I also think it's important to remember that there's also this kind of like deep like ethnic hostility that is behind a lot of this. So, for example, like a large portion of the ruling class is Jewish, and they have this like deeply held hatred for white people based on their perceived perceived historical. I don't want to say oppression. Historical grievances that they
Yeah,
have.
no, we talked about that on the show before, that
Yeah.
at the center of the Jewish identity is a unique hostility towards the European people. And I think a lot of the times, and we've covered a lot of Jewish books in that sense, where they openly admit to this. They openly say, like, we've had a bad history with Europeans, so we need to treat them as a group that must be broken up for our own survival. That's what they'll say.
Yes. So that, I mean, that's a major element of
That's right.
it.
I don't want people to think I'm being soft on that either. Good. Thank you for bringing that up. I was about to get into. I might sound like a shit lib at the end of this,
Yeah,
but that is true.
and then you also have to consider that a lot of now you have a situation where there's a lot of as a result of kind of these policies, a lot of non-whites are now rising to positions of authority and positions of rising into the elite in Western countries, and a lot of them, whether it's because whether it's for the sake of their own ethnic interests or because, due to the media, they've now been instilled with this own kind of sense of grievance against us. Now, many of them have adopted this. It's kind of funny that if you go to somewhere in Asia, they actually kind of like white people, but then once they come to the West, now they begin to hate us.
That is true. Yeah, there's not. We can talk all day about what to do about that. I don't want to get anyone in trouble here, but it's probably stuff you've talked about before. And I like to remind people that a lot of the problems that we're facing, it's an intersection of many other problems. Just to wrap up the point I was making before we have to go, for my own little kooky theory, what I was essentially trying to say was a population that is not necessarily interested in breeding would be a desirable population for them because they can control that better. So if you are sort of a confused, the way I looked at it before was like, it's well known that the birth rates in the West are falling. And governments tend to be pretty good at addressing things they think are a problem. So, for whatever reason, it seems to be inarguable that they don't seem to think falling birth rates in the West are a problem. So that, no matter what, we have to keep that in our minds that they're not interested in any way in increasing the birth rate. They might be more interested in driving it down and creating an environment where, if people don't have kids, if they're busy, and here's where it gets really crazy. I just want to put this on the record. One conspiracy you can look at is that if transhumanism is inevitable, because it might be, on a long enough timeline, that might be the future that we're hurtling towards, and it's what we do about that. If they can instill in its population the desire not to be a Superman, over the course of generations, if you grant a population the ability to edit its own genes, if you've instilled in them the desire that they don't want to make perfect genes, they actually want to be inferior, that would solve the problem for the governments of out of control gene editing, making too intelligent or too people who want to reproduce too much. They might be looking ahead and planning to make it so people want to gene edit themselves into this sort of queer inferiority. Now that's a kooky one, but I think that's something worth talking about too.
Well, I don't know about that. That's something that it's looking pretty far into the future. Again, I don't know. I'm not someone who knows genetics. I don't know gene editing or anything like that, so I'm not going to claim to be well versed on that one. But yeah, I do think that you can see that where they'd be going with the transhumanism, especially when you consider the climate agenda and how that by design is going to drastically reduce the quality of life of regular people. It does seem like transhumanism is possibly something that can be brought in to basically make up for the fact that the life that they have planned for you is basically miserable. It's going to be you living in your 15-minute city with the meme now, in the pod eating the bugs. Transhumanism kind of seems like something that they can bring in order to say, well, your actual life now is trash, but well, here's this transhumanism where you can plug your mind into a computer and upload yourself into the internet or whatever it is that they want to do with that.
Yeah, imagine the crazy conversation, because people think of gene editing and transhumanism of augmenting their body to make a more perfect entity. But let's say you're a parent 10 generations in the future, and the gene editing you're offered is, here your son will have a better shot at life if you tweak his DNA so he has to eat less. Wouldn't that be good? Like you've convinced the population to almost devolve by selling them that's superior evolution. That's a kind of a science fiction story, perhaps, but I think it's important people think like this because, hey, if we can think like this, maybe someone up there thought of it too. That's like the worst case scenario where you're not living in a cool cyberpunk world anymore. You're actually gene editing your kids to make them small. You're making them into rat people because, that increases their chance of survival, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. I mean, to be fair, I actually don't think a lot of this stuff is going to happen because I just have a hard time when you look at just how ambitious something like Agenda 2030 is and the degree to which it will basically require them to restructure all of society, and how it pretty much requires like absolute surveillance of every aspect of people's lives, and to hook every single tiny detail of people's lives up into a grid. I have my doubts of whether or not any of this stuff is actually going to work. I think, the problem is though that they're going to try, and well, what happens? What happens when it doesn't work? I mean, that's
Yeah, I will say probably the best argument against the sort of alternate matrix reality is that VR really hasn't taken off like they thought it would.
yes,
Anytime people are given the chance to really live in this dystopian future, I remember Google Glass coming out like 10 years ago, and that was supposed to be revolutionary. None of this stuff really seems to take off, even with the moneyed demographic that it's supposed to be targeting. So there's something in there that gives me a bit of hope.
well, just look at the metaverse. Like, if you remember, this was announced less than 2 years ago. I think it was late 2021 when the metaverse was being launched, and we were all coming out with our talking points that, like, this is going to be people hooked up to these headsets, sitting in these giant towers of glass and steel, living their lives in this virtual reality. That thing's been a total failure. They're shutting, like, Meta, the company Facebook. They're basically abandoning that project because it's just been a complete disaster. They haven't been able. They put billions upon billions into that. I
Yeah.
think it's up in the hundreds of billions, and it's just been a total loss for them. So, I mean, that is a white. I mean, it could be a white pill in one way that people are. It could possibly mean that people want a more authentic life, and they're not. They're kind of getting exhausted with all this technology, or it could just mean that they can't be bothered because they have, like, the 30-second long TikTok videos to keep them occupied, and that's what they're spending their time
Yeah,
on.
it's the dumb shit that seems to work. And for me, I tend to be pretty early interested in this stuff. And I was big into the metaverse because I'm like, okay, this is an experiment to see if they can introduce real value into a digital space, kind of like the NFT revolution that we saw. I'm like, this will be interesting if they can actually make the digital space more real. And I'm like, there's all kinds of crazy shit that could happen. And it just flopped. And I was surprised at how open Meta was of its failure. Because the moment Mark Zuckerberg got up in front of the shareholders and said, I'm sorry, I played this one wrong, I'm like, oh, it's dead. If he had gotten up there and actually owned it and said, we got to stay the course on this, we have infinity dollars we can invest. But when he stepped back, I said, oh, this is just dead. And if I'm being honest, I think crypto generally, and I was big into Bitcoin way, way, way back in the day, it didn't take off as fast and as big. It's still kind of a mess. It's still like we're still figuring it out. There's still the power brokers are still trying to figure out what to do with it. Like we're still figuring out a lot of this stuff that in our dystopian fantasies should have been dystopian by now. So the fact that everything hasn't come crashing down, like that's kind of a white pill if you want to call it that.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you look at, I mean, I'm not a big person into crypto, but yeah, with something like the metaverse, it was just a total failure. I mean, the actual footage that I watched of it, it looked like a video game from 2004.
It looked like shit. I don't know I'm like, you guys could have made it look better, but you chose not. It's an N64 game if you look at it. I'm like, there's a lot of puzzling decisions made.
They couldn't even animate legs for the avatars.
Yeah, I'm like, but you guys could have. Like, I don't know why made those decisions. And I'd like to really unpack that at some point in the future. What the fuck happened in the metaverse? Because you don't lose $200 billion or whatever it was, $1 trillion without a story there. Who? Because I don't think anyone got fired. Someone. So was this a giant money laundering scheme? What the fuck happened with this thing that was supposed to? Any revolution that doesn't take off, I want to know the story about why it didn't take off. Right when it seemed when it had no limit of resources to take off. You know. Because
Yeah,
I was trying to get our guys involved. I'm like, okay, this might be a new platform for a bunch of young right wing guys to stake a claim. Because I was getting excited, but I'm like, every time a new platform launches, there's this glorious window of time where the corporations aren't there yet, and all their money doesn't fucking matter, and a lot of scrappy small guys can actually make a big waves. And TikTok was kind of like that too. But I'm like, this could be it for us. And then it wasn't. So now I got egg on my face.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of writing a Substack article at some point, basically like just analyzing the downfall of the metaverse, because it's something that, I mean, it was big news when it was announced in our sphere, but it kind of just like in the metaverse itself, it kind of just faded from the public view. It's not really something people talk about anymore, but it is fascinating to see like just how little interest there really was in any of this VR stuff.
Yeah. And we tend, not to sound mean to anyone in particular, but our side tends to not be on the cutting edge of technology adoption. We tend to be a bit more cynical. We don't like, it took us for, like, most of us are on Telegram because it's a place where freaks go, which I love about it. But like, we tend to not like new technology. Maybe that's our bias because we tend to be older or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I wish we were a bit more eager to get in these spaces, but also, TikTok isn't great either. I'm trying to actually build up a TikTok channel for the show, but it's got a big problem with bots. I'm not thrilled with either. Anyway, I know we're past our time now. We actually have to get going. So what I want is for people who are interested in anything that we talked about today, I want you to check out Endeavor's Substack, and that is royalendeavour.substack.com. Check him out on Twitter at Royal Endeavour. And don't forget to check out Morgoth and Endeavour classic movie reviews. You can find that on YouTube. You can find that on Odyssey. You can find that all kinds of places. Is there anything that I had missed there that you would like to plug?
Oh, not really. I primarily use Telegram and for my posts. So Twitter, I'm not that active on anymore. I basically just share content there. But places to follow me: Telegram, YouTube, or Odyssey, and Substack. So that's where you can find me.
Fantastic. And once again, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I had a great time, and I bet everyone's going to love it as well.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem. Talk to you soon.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.